Hello, everyone. So welcome to the Robert H. Jackson Center. My name is Kristen McMahon, and I have the privilege of serving as the president here. Thank you for joining us today for what is the first in our 2026 program series, 25 Years of Asking Questions. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. Please make sure your mobile phones are silenced or turned off. I promise you think that they are not. If you need a restroom, they are outside the doors on the left. There will be a time for Q&A after the formal presentation, and this program is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube. So just wanted to give you fair warning on that. The Robert H. Jackson Center is a nonpartisan nonprofit and a registered 501c3. Because education was such a critical part of Robert H. Jackson's success, we do not charge for any of our programs, events, or for tours of our beautiful facility. Our success and sustainability is 100% reliant on philanthropy. So if you would like to support our programs, our mission, and our work, please consider making a donation today. We are celebrating a plethora of anniversaries this year. First, we are celebrating the 250th anniversary of our country, and the center has a long history of civic-related programming, and that absolutely will continue this year. And in fact, I invite you to join us on January 30th for 1A Day, where you can continue to dive into some of what we will explore today. Second, we are about 1.5 months into marking the 80th anniversary of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, at which Robert H. Jackson served as the chief U.S. counsel. We kicked off an international symposium on November 21st, and that was the actual 80th anniversary of Jackson's opening statement at Nuremberg. This international series is designed to run the entire length of the trial, so there will be one program a month through October of this year. And these programs are all held virtually at noon. And in fact, the latest one was earlier today with our partners at the Truman Presidential Library and Museum. You are welcome to join us here for a watch party for future ones as well. Third, this July, we will celebrate the 85th anniversary of Jackson's appointment to the United States Supreme Court. And a lot of what we will cover this year with these questions are questions that he wrestled with during his time on the court. And finally, we, the center, began celebrating our 25th anniversary in December of 2025. For 25 years, we have brought historic figures, renowned authors, passionate practitioners, legal luminaries, and teachers of all kinds to Jamestown, Chautauqua County, Washington, D.C., Nuremberg, and to your computer screens as well. We have hosted conversations on challenging topics. We have created informative exhibits on Jackson's life and his cases. We have augmented student education on the Holocaust, civil rights, the legal system, and history. We have inspired interns and fellows to pursue their dreams. And frankly, we've educated anyone who will stand still long enough to listen to us. We have enjoyed learning with you, and we look forward to continuing to do that this year and for the next 25 years as well. So, for our 25th anniversary, our program theme is 25 years of asking questions. One of the fundamental precepts of the center is that we do not tell you what to think. We give you access to experts and information and the tools to help you determine how to think and to analyze those thoughts and then to take them out into the world and do something with them. All of our 2026 programs will lean into this deeply, starting with tonight's program. Do we still believe in free speech? One of Jackson's most quoted opinions is from West Virginia Board of Education versus Barnette, which is the Jehovah's Witness flag salute case. In that opinion, Jackson wrote, "The very purpose of the Bill of Rights was to withdraw certain subjects from the vicissitudes of political controversy. I do practice saying these things out loud too, just in case you were curious. To place them beyond the reach of majorities and officials and establish them as legal principles to be applied by the courts. The First Amendment, as the first of the Bill of Rights, uses 45 words to protect 5 freedoms. There's going to be a little bit of audience participation here. What are those 5? Speech, assembly, religion. We've got speech, assembly, and religion. Press. You got it. Petition, thank you. Our Director of Programs and Education over there. Very good. Per the Freedom Forum, the First Amendment is the best known and most valued amendment in the Bill of Rights. And while I am not an expert on this, from my perspective, the First Amendment is also one of the most misunderstood. For many, the amendment is a get-out-of-trouble-free card, believing it gives them the right to say or write anything to anyone without consequences of any kind. And on the flip side, that it is implicated anytime someone says something they disagree with. Debate and dissent are very important in a democracy, and we should foster and teach how to do both of those. That used to be something that students were educated in, and the ability to see multiple sides in an issue is a valuable skill. In Jackson's view, the First Amendment freedoms ensured that citizens could make their discontent known, so that the subject of that discontent could be addressed publicly. However, the expression of this discontent is still governed by law. Although all citizens had the obligation to tolerate and reply to open dissent, no matter how disagreeable, Jackson said, quote, "This concept of liberty had no tolerance of any form of lawlessness, no belief that there could be freedom except under the law." And so we are delighted to have Aaron Saykin with us this evening to help us wrestle with this question. Do we still believe in free speech? Aaron is a partner at Hodgson Russ LLP in Buffalo. He leads the firm's media and First Amendment practice area, helping clients navigate issues such as defamation, free speech, licensing, press relations, and related issues, including New York's open meetings laws and the Freedom of Information law. He draws from a wealth of media experience, having spent 13 years as an investigative television reporter in Pittsburgh, Buffalo, and Wilmington, North Carolina, before becoming a lawyer. And he received his bachelor's degree summa cum laude from the University of Massachusetts Amherst and his Juris Doctorate magna cum laude from the University at Buffalo School of Law. Would you please help me welcome Aaron Saykin?
Thank you very much. So thank you all for the warm welcome. It's wonderful to be able to get down here to Jamestown. If it's all right with everybody, I'm going to move around a little bit instead of standing behind the podium, try to bring a little energy to the presentation. I always start with this slide. It's a disclaimer. My law firm makes me do it. Anything I say, and it's probably because we're being recorded, and I'll tell you a quick story about that. But anything I say is not legal advice, and if I give an opinion, it's not the opinion of my firm. It's how I see and how I read First Amendment jurisprudence from over the years. So I will tell you a quick story about the disclaimer. Several years ago, I was working on a case where a colleague of mine had given a presentation about a statute. And in that presentation, he gave his opinion on how the statute should be interpreted, okay? Fast forward a year or two later, and that presentation, by the way, was made available online where he gave it. Fast forward a couple of years later, I'm defending someone, a client, a business in a case. And I had to take the position, a different position on what that statute meant, different from what my colleague had said in the presentation. Wouldn't you know, the attorneys from the other side scoured the internet And they found that statement. I didn't say it, my colleague said it. And they put it right in their briefs to the court. And I'm thinking, judge isn't going to pay attention to that. Well, he writes this 25, 30-page decision. And a quote from my colleague's presentation is block quoted right in the middle of the page. I'm like, oh boy. And then I went to the appeals court. And one of the first questions I got from the appellate justices was, your own colleague doesn't even agree with you. So anyway, that's why I'm careful. The First Amendment is something that's near and dear to me, because not only do I practice it as a lawyer, I practiced it, I lived it as a journalist for 13 years. And actually even before that, when I was in high school and college, I worked for newspapers as a stringer. So it's a protection that is important. The freedom of speech is important. And that's going to be at the bedrock of a lot of what we're speaking about tonight. So here's an overview. I first want to talk about a few decisions authored by Justice Jackson with respect to the First Amendment and freedom of speech. I think they're important, and they're going to set the groundwork for what we're going to talk about for today. Then we're going to pivot to today's issues and takeaways. Different types of flashpoints for the First Amendment that have percolated over the last decade or so. The fights in some ways are growing more intense than they have been in a while. And by fights, I mean legal fights. And I think Justice Jackson can give some valuable perspective just by reading what he wrote 80 years ago. I also want to talk a little bit about online platforms. It's not necessarily directly a First Amendment issue per se, but it's related to what we're talking about, and I get tons of questions about these issues. And then finally, I want to open it up for a discussion about what would Justice Jackson do. And when I say open it up for a discussion, I want this to be interactive. If I'm talking about something and you have a question or a comment, fire away. Do not worry about interrupting me. I think it will make the experience more interactive and enjoyable. So we heard about the 45 words, 5 protections. The one we're going to focus on tonight is the freedom of speech. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. There are exceptions to that, though. As we heard a moment ago, speech has its limits. Speech that incites lawlessness or fighting words, something Justice Jackson focused on quite a bit in his decisions. We're going to hear about that. Defamation is another example. Yes, you can say what you want about somebody else, but there are consequences if what you say is false and defamatory. There's obscenity and child pornography. There's intellectual property that belongs to others. That's protected. Commercial speech is governed and regulated in ways that are different from other types of speech. And then finally, speech involving the government, which you almost never hear about, where the government is the speaker. You've mentioned the seminal majority decision in West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnette. Here's an excellent quote, very commonly cited quote from what Justice Jackson wrote. If there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein. And that was the case where a school policy required students to stand and recite the Pledge of Allegiance. Justice Jackson wrote, "Those who begin coercive elimination of dissent soon find themselves exterminating dissenters. Compulsory unification of opinion achieves only the unanimity of the graveyard." Pretty solemn. And he was a product, I believe, of his time and his environment. There's a photo there of him at Nuremberg, which I got from your website. I hope you don't mind as I talk about intellectual property. But it's important because I believe, and I think there are a number of scholars who have written about this, that shaped some of his views about the First Amendment. Now, the quote I read on the previous page is frequently cited for the proposition that Justice Jackson was a champion of broad protections for free speech. I think when people say that, they are vastly oversimplifying him as a justice, as a legal scholar, and as someone who penned some of the most prominent Supreme Court opinions in history. His First Amendment decisions, particularly those with respect to speech, those decisions were much more nuanced, they were much more practical, and there's a word and a theme I think that's going to come up a lot. They were incredibly thoughtful and careful. And this was especially true after World War II. He carefully weighed the value of absolute free speech against its consequences. You don't hear that all the time. I mean, his views were widely believed to have been shaped by his experience at Nuremberg. Why is that? Well, when you're prosecuting those war criminals, you understand how a country went from a democracy to what ultimately happened in Nazi Germany. Justice Jackson understood how people were manipulated by speeches and lies, and how mobs of extremists can silence moderate voices. And that's not my opinion. He wrote about that. He wrote about those dangers. And that was part of how he weighed the protections of the First Amendment versus what are reasonable restrictions upon it. There's tension in it. And I think if you read some of what he wrote that we're going to look at in a moment, you're going to find that it is not only relevant today, it's prescient or predictive of some of the battles over speech and related issues that we're having today. So we'll start with one opinion, Coons versus New York. It's a very famous Supreme Court opinion. It was a challenge to a New York City law that required a person to obtain a permit to give a religious speech on street corners. And that permit could be revoked, right, if there were complaints or they thought you weren't complying with the spirit of the requirements. So in this case, the plaintiff's permit was revoked after there were numerous complaints that he was antagonizing people and stirring up hatred, anger, and threats of violence. This is right out of the decision. He called Jews Christ killers. He called Catholicism the religion of the devil. And his permit was revoked. The Supreme Court looked at the New York City law that resulted in the revocation of his permit, and they said that law was unconstitutional because it governed the content of the speaker, right? It made a determination based on what he was saying. And that's what the majority decision said. Justice Jackson wrote the dissent. He said there's a world of difference between speaking freely from the pulpit versus speaking on the street. On the street, he said, a speaker can impose his ideas and speech on the people walking by. He can impose his message on the public. On private property, from the pulpit, people go voluntarily. He thought, when writing a decision, you should treat those two instances differently. And he thought words on a street corner can create a, quote, clear and present danger. Those are the fighting words that could incite a riot, or yelling fire, right, in a crowded theater. That's the example everybody knows about restricting speech. He said we should weight the value of insulting speech against its potentiality for harm. Here's a great quote, because I think it sets the stage for much of what is debated today. In a free society, all sects and factions, as the price of their own freedom to preach their views, must suffer that freedom in others. Tolerance of unwelcome, unorthodox ideas or information is a constitutionally protected policy not to be defeated by persons who would break up meetings they do not relish. But here's where he pivots. But emergencies may arise on streets which would become catastrophes if there was not immediate police action. The crowd, which should be tolerant, may be prejudiced and angry or malicious. If the situation threatens to get out of hand for the force present, I think the police may require the speaker, even if within his rights, to yield his right temporarily to the greater interest of peace. This last sentence is everything if you're going to apply this test. Of course, the threat must be judged in good faith to be real, immediate, and serious. Question is, who's doing the judging, right? And how they're doing it. And that is where so many of the battle lines are drawn now. Do they have too much discretion in how they're able to make that determination? So many freedom of speech cases are fought over whether the person making that decision has, you may hear this term, you're not going to hear it tonight too much, but you may hear this when you read an article about it, unbridled discretion. A policy, a statute can be unconstitutional if the person making the determination has unbridled discretion. Another decision where he wrote about weighing, about balancing. This is a case that involved the city of Chicago. There was an ordinance that prohibited misbehavior, and this is a quote from the ordinance, which stirs the public to anger, invites dispute, brings about a condition of unrest, or creates a disturbance. Now, in this case, a controversial speaker was convicted of a crime of disturbing the peace after speaking to a huge crowd in an auditorium. There were over 1,000 protesters outside. He had condemned the conduct of the crowd outside vigorously, if not viciously, and criticized political and racial groups. So you can imagine the tension. He was stirring up a hornet's nest on the inside and on the outside. The protesters, unsurprisingly, became angry and turbulent. Police couldn't calm them, so they arrested the speaker and they charged him with breach of peace. He was convicted. The Supreme Court reversed the conviction, holding that the ordinance was unconstitutional. Simply put, there was too much discretion in determining what violated that. The majority of the court, with which Justice Jackson did not side, wrote the following: a function of free speech under our system of government is to invite dispute. It may indeed best serve its high purpose when it induces a condition of unrest, creates dissatisfaction with conditions as they are, or even stirs people to anger. Speech is often provocative and challenging. It may strike at prejudices and preconceptions and have profound unsettling effects as it presses for acceptance of an idea. That is why freedom of speech, though not absolute, is nevertheless protected against censorship or punishment, unless shown likely to produce, and there are these words again, a clear and present danger of a serious substantive evil that rises far above public inconvenience, annoyance, or unrest. There is no room under our Constitution for a more restrictive view. For the alternative would lead to standardization of ideas either by legislatures, courts, or dominant political or community groups. Justice Jackson said in his dissent, "Pump the brakes." He believed the court wasn't thinking granularly enough about how these instances play out. Remember Nuremberg? I think he was concerned about what he saw in other democracies, basically how these freedoms can be perverted by people to destroy them, right? They will use them against a civilized society to destroy it. That was his fear. He wrote in dissent, "Unity of purpose, passion, and hatred, which merges the many minds of a crowd into the mindlessness of a mob, almost invariably is supplied by speeches. It is naive or worse to teach that oratory with this object or effect is a service to liberty. No mob has ever protected any liberty, even its own, but if not put down, it always winds up in an orgy of lawlessness which respects no liberties." I think his dissent in these cases best summarize the tension that he saw within the First Amendment, right? Which is we have to protect speech. We have to protect the public from imposed conformity. But mobs can get out of hand. So here's the question. And this is something we can talk about, I think, as the evening goes on. Who was right? Who was wrong here? Maybe they were both part right and part wrong. I don't know. It's not easy. What Justice Jackson did in the dissent and what the majority did in its decision was try to get the reader to conceptualize what would happen if you play these rulings out to their extremes, right? And I think they both made valid points. So this is what I would say is how I would conceptualize Justice Jackson's framing of the dangers, right, of the majority opinion in there about maybe regulating speech in some way, like the type in Chicago. Violence erupts, right? He wrote, fascist and communist groups, you have to remember this is the late 40s and early 50s, fascist and communist groups resort to these terror tactics to confuse, bully, and discredit those freely chosen governments. Violent and noisy shows of strength discourage participation of moderates in discussions so fraught with violence, and real discussion dries up and disappears. As Jackson warned, the Bill of Rights is converted into a suicide pact. I should say pact. Liberty and order give way to anarchy without either. If you wonder how he's relevant today, I think you just have to read that in some way to the struggles and the fights. And I'm not necessarily speaking about the last 12 months or in recent memory. I think even if you go back 25 years, you start to see this escalating in different areas where the stakes have become higher, the tension has become higher in these First Amendment battles. The majority thought if you played out Justice Jackson's thinking to its extreme, there are also dangers. You start a slippery slope, right? Who decides when it's gone too far? How do they decide when the speech has gone too far? The mob knows that it can shut down the speaker by acting unruly. This happens all the time. This issue arises all the time on college campuses and in protests. It's known as the heckler's veto. Let's start such a commotion that whether it's the police, whether it's a government entity, shuts down the speech, not because of what the speaker is saying, but because how people will react to it. It's a common tactic. Also, it can be a crime if you give a speech that stirs people to anger, invites public dispute, brings about a condition of unrest. Who decides that? There's an example I give today, and this is an somewhat extreme example for a democracy. But look at the United Kingdom and some of the statutes they've passed since the 1990s. Now, they don't have a constitutional protection for embedded constitutional protection for freedom of speech like we do. They have protections, but not bedrock protections. They have passed laws that criminalize the sending of indecent or grossly offensive messages or using communication networks to cause annoyance, inconvenience, or needless anxiety. How many of you, anybody in here, have any teenagers? Okay. I have a tween, and I could tell you that they think everything causes needless anxiety. We joke, I joke, but it's serious. And when you have a statute that I am certain was well-intentioned to stop cyberbullying, there can be consequences to how it is applied, real life consequences. This is true. People have been prosecuted in England for posting on social media things like rap lyrics deemed to be racist or tweets that include transphobic insults. They've been convicted. Those convictions were overturned, right? But as you can imagine, going through that process and having to get a conviction overturned could be ruinous, right, to a person's life, certainly financially. If you were to play out regulation to an extreme, maybe that's what it looks like. I don't know. But there's a spectrum, right? And that's always been how the First Amendment has been viewed, right? There's some absolute exceptions where you can restrict speech, like defamation, like copyright protection, things like that. Then you start moving down the line. You get a little bit closer, fighting words. Okay, I think that's your fire in a crowded theater. Then you keep going and going and going and going. Where does it stop? That's what some of today's battles are about. So I've got 3 examples for the type of fights that I think we commonly see today. 2 of them are of the type of character that I'm involved in. And they range from mundane and not of massive consequence to of the highest consequence. We're going to start a little lower. Start with something that there's maybe a little bit of humor to. All right, for those of you who understand what the sign on the screen means, don't say anything yet. I will explain if you don't. This first category I would classify as the annoying stuff, the why, okay? So about a decade ago, I'm at my computer. There's a new Supreme Court decision about free speech involving a town ordinance in Arizona on regulating signs. And I start reading it and I go, ooh, this is kind of problematic or difficult to implement. All right. So the town has an ordinance. It does a number of things regulating signs. One of them is it limits the size of political signs, okay? Limits the display to election season only. It's got rules about temporary signs. It says a church may only post a temporary directional sign for a service, has to take it down within a certain amount of time. Well, a church in this town in Arizona was fined for exceeding that time limit. It sued. It said, look, that town code is regulating these signs based on their content. They're regulating my sign, my church sign, because it says church stuff. It says a service. And because it's regulating speech based on content, the court should apply strict scrutiny to it. That's the highest level of scrutiny a court will apply to a regulation of speech or conduct. Basically, what that means is there has to be a compelling government interest to do it. You got to show that. Plus, that the law is narrowly tailored to that end. It's a high bar. It's not easy to meet. So the town says, whoa, time out. We can do this. This law that we have on the books, it's content neutral. It applies to all political speech. It doesn't say, only Democratic signs, or it doesn't say negative signs versus positive signs. It's not regulating content. It's just applying it to political signs. It doesn't regulate the message. Justice Thomas wrote the majority decision. So nope, this law violates the First Amendment. It regulates signs differently based on their content. Political signs are treated different because of their content versus temporary religious service signs. And the town failed to meet the strict scrutiny test. So this is why this is a decision. Imagine you're on a town board somewhere, a municipal board, and you want to regulate. All right, well, let me back up. There's this neighborhood where these people One side of the street, they like one group, the other side, they like the other. They keep their political signs up year round. Can't we just see them during election season, right? So it's your job, Mr. or Ms. Town Board member, to come up with a statute or an ordinance so we can have them or make these people take these signs down when it's not election season. How do you do that? Any ideas? Zoning. You do it with zoning, exactly. And what would you write in the zoning code? I saw your hand up way back there.
Let her finish.
Oh, I choose zone, signs only can, any sign can only be up for this amount of time.
Okay, let me play the devil's advocate. I have a law office in my house. So you're telling me that for only during election season, my clients or prospective clients can know where my office is and what door to walk in? I'll give $20 to somebody who can solve this. And the reason why I'm willing to offer $20 to someone who can solve this is I can't. Okay. This is excuse my language, for those of you here and watching on YouTube, this is a pain in the ass. You know, you can say signs can only be a certain size, but then it's got to apply to all signs, right? I think it's unwieldy. So here's the story, and here's why I have the sign that says, "Let's go, Brandon." Okay. So, gosh, it would have been shortly after Joe Biden got elected. A municipal client calls me up and says, somebody in our municipality, so rural part of it, big front yard, puts up almost the equivalent of a billboard sign, and spray painted on that sign it says F, the full word, Joe Biden, exclamation point. This person from the municipality says, look, we've got buses with kids as young as pre-K who go by. This isn't it's really upsetting. We're getting a lot of complaints. People are telling me I got to tell this guy to take the sign down. And he said, "Can I do that? You know, it's obscenity. It's swearing." And I said, "Nope, you can't do that. Not like that here, because it's got to go further than just profanity." There's a Supreme Court decision from the early 70s where this guy wears a jacket that says, again, the whole word F the draft. That in and of itself isn't enough to take down a sign. So, of course, the client says, and I'm the lawyer, well, what do I do? I said, well, all right, let's have to be creative. Why don't you call up the guy and say, hey, can you do me a favor? I get it. I don't like Biden either, but there's a lot of kids who come by here or whatever. Could you maybe, I get the sentiment, could you maybe change the sign and put up, "Let's go, Brandon"? And as the story was relayed to me, the guy who put up the sign laughed, and eventually he said, okay. Why was he willing to go along with "Let's go, Brandon"? Does anybody know? All right. So, Joe Biden's first year in office as president, there's a NASCAR race. And at the end of the race, the driver wins the race, gets out of the vehicle, he's celebrating. His name's Brandon Brown, NASCAR driver. The crowd is chanting at Talladega. Imagine the whole place chanting. And NBC's doing a live interview with him. They're chanting, "F Joe Biden," but they're not saying F. They're saying the whole world, "F Joe Biden." And louder and louder and louder. It's bleeding right through. The whole audience is seeing it. And the woman, God bless her, is interviewing Brandon, and she said, "Brandon, a great race. You can hear the crowd behind you chanting, 'Let's go, Brandon.'" And so within a couple of weeks, everybody thought it was hilarious because the crowd plainly was not chanting that. I don't think she was trying to just gloss over the profanity. I think that's probably what she heard with a headset on. But anyway, "Let's go, Brandon" was code for F Joe Biden. And so that was the way around that. That's the All right. Example 2, escalate a little bit here. This is more serious. than a yard sign. Not that yard signs aren't important. These were two decisions. They really were less decisions and more action taken by the Supreme Court in the last couple of years. These were challenges, and this is a sphere where I work quite a bit. I help higher education clients navigate First Amendment issues. These were challenges to college bias response teams. Apparently, according to the Supreme Court decision, there's over 450 of these teams at colleges and universities in the U.S. Copycat world, I guess. So these college bias response teams encourage students to report one another for expressions of bias and then review and act upon reports. They can report anonymously. Bias incidents include any conduct, speech, or expression motivated in whole or in part by bias or prejudice meant to intimidate, demean, mock, degrade, marginalize, or threaten individuals or groups based on that individual or group's actual or perceived identities. It's pretty broad. Students were reporting any and all perceived slights. Again, I have a tween, everything's a slight. Not to say that some of these probably were not completely legitimate gripes. I'm sure there was racism, sexism, you name it, mixed into the cocktail. But some of them weren't. This team itself had no disciplinary power, these teams, but they obviously can refer the matter to the campus offices that do. So what happened? The Supreme Court declined to take the cases. The first one involved Virginia Tech. The university changed the policy, which mooted the case. In other words, policy is not in existence anymore. You can't be harmed by it. Plus, the team had no disciplinary power, which I don't know if that's a bit of a cop-out, but the university, only the university or the college could do the disciplining. So you couldn't sue over the team itself. Second one involved Indiana University. Lower court ruled that the group that brought the challenge, Speech First Incorporated, lacked standing. They were trying to do it on behalf of these students who were feeling chilled into speaking. They said, no, the students themselves have to bring the case. But what was interesting about this declined cases, in each of them, you got dissents from Justice Alito and Justice Thomas, who wrote, the scope of Virginia Tech's policy, combined with how it is enforced, suggests that the university is stifling students' speech. What do you think? Do these teams violate the First Amendment by chilling people into speaking?
Yes.
They might. I would say it probably depends on the facts and circumstances. And then the question is, are their powers too broad? I'm going to mention something very quickly before we skip ahead to the third and the most serious of the three examples I want to give about these current flashpoints. I get the question all the time, why can't you do something when somebody posts something about me on Facebook or Twitter or somewhere on social media? Why can't I sue them for their conduct? Well, this is a funny story that sort of has a serious takeaway. Remember Representative Devin Nunes from California? Some people with a sense of humor created two Twitter accounts, now X. There was at Devin Nunes' cow, and then at Devin Nunes' mom. And they were, if you believe in law and order, vote for his opponent. If you believe in obstruction of justice and perjury, vote for him. He obviously wasn't happy. So he sues. He sues Twitter. He sues one of the Twitter users who reposted one of these. And he sues the two accounts named after his mom and his cow. Lawsuit was widely mocked. Several legal analysts predicted it would fail. Why? Well, issue one, there are legal protections, you may not know this, for social media platforms like X, Twitter, for comments posted by its users. Nunes said, no. Twitter has a duty to police these comments. Issue number two, which probably occurred to some of you who are interested in the First Amendment, which is that these are almost certainly parodies. I mean, nobody believes Devin Nunes' cow sitting there with its hoofs tweeting away. And I doubt that anybody really believes Devin Nunes' mom is doing that. So what happened? All the claims against Twitter were dismissed. And that's because interactive online media platforms like Twitter and Facebook, they're typically not liable for comments posted by their users under Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. I guarantee you, if you read the news in the next year, you are going to hear about this statute. It generally does not treat these websites as publishers. When the newspaper publishes something defamatory, you can sue them. Not Twitter and Facebook and these online interactive platforms. And holding number 2, the court said, yeah, you can sue these people, but he couldn't identify the at Devin Nunes' mom and at Devin Nunes' cow, so he couldn't serve them. He couldn't serve the complaint, and that was that. So the Communications Decency Act of 1996, this is why we can't sue these entities. It was adopted to encourage internet service providers to remove offensive or indecent material. And it also came about at a time, let me ask you this. Does anybody remember Prodigy? It's an online dial-up service it was popular in the 80s, probably into the 90s until AOL took off, right? It would have like restaurant reviews and things where people would put them on there. Prodigy was sued for an anonymous post. The court found that it was the publisher of the comments and therefore liable for defamation. When this was passed in 1996, the internet was still in its infancy for the public, right? And Congress at the time, makes sense, didn't want to stifle this new frontier, this new innovation. So it wrote a statute that said the provider of an interactive computer service, where people post their own comments, shall not be treated as a publisher or speaker of the information, so long as the platform allows others to provide and post the content, and it does not provide or edit the content themselves. They are immune. So if they don't edit it, open season. There was a case at the Supreme Court 3 years ago where YouTube and other social media companies, YouTube in particular, was sued for aiding and abetting a terrorist attack, the ISIS attack in Paris, because they were hosting the content of terrorists, not removing it. And they were even recommending it to people. You know how if you're watching those videos, things will pop up, recommended for you. Apparently it was recommending these videos. And they won. They couldn't be sued under the Communications Decency Act. There's been a movement in Congress for a while to fix this, but the problem is, like many things, the two sides can't agree. Right? Politicians on the left, they tend to want internet platforms to remove more false or offensive or dangerous content. Right? The right has a different perspective. They want there to be consequences for these platforms if they remove content based on viewpoint.
Sir,
Yes.
I kind of disagree with you.
Okay.
The problem is the politicians are too old, they don't understand the technology. And that's why they don't know how to fix it.
Well, that's a problem too. This isn't a knock to being an octogenarian, but I think our members of Congress are not the youngest members of society anymore. They stick around for a long time, and that may be an issue as well. Some of them are retiring, but I don't know. I don't know if I completely agree with that. I think that they all have their own interest in attacking a particular facet of the act, if that makes sense.
I want to say there's a groundswell to fix Section 230. I think these deepfake videos are going to make it to a point where something has to be done.
I agree. You cannot tell the difference between what is fake and what is real anymore. The technology has gotten so good. It's staggering. All right, I'm going to move through this last part quickly. Oh, sure, yes.
Was there ever a movement, since they couldn't prosecute the Twitter, et cetera, to make it that the users had to be registered and known to post any kind of information?
That has been, I don't know if it's been in the context of this act, but that's been talked about a lot, and here's what I mean. If I have a client who's had something posted about them, like whether it's a negative review that's completely false, how do you find out who's behind it without sending a subpoena to whatever the platform is that hosts the review or the comment? It's anonymous. It's tricky legally. I don't think that the platforms would want to do that. There'd be less traffic and there'd be less activity if they did it. But that has been, I don't know if it's been discussed in Congress, but I've heard people many times calling for some way to find out who it is who's actually saying these things about you. Oh, let me go back. So, okay, this is the most serious First Amendment issue of the three. This is just this past year came up. This is in the District of Massachusetts Federal Court. It's a challenge to the policy of the Secretaries of State and Homeland Security. This policy was for immigration enforcement against non-citizens who engage in pro-Palestinian or anti-Israel speech. So the plaintiffs in this case argued that this enforcement policy violates the First Amendment because it targets individuals based on their viewpoint with the goal of chilling the speech of other people. You know, basically, you're one of these anti-Israel protesters, you're a non-citizen, ICE or INS is going to show up and we're going to deport you. But not just deport you for that, there was a statutory reason to do it. And the government argued in response, look, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 allows the deportation of a non-citizen, and this is right out of the law, whose presence or activities in the United States the Secretary of State has reasonable ground to believe would have potentially serious adverse foreign policy consequences for the United States. And government said, we have reasonable grounds here with these people. This hurts our foreign policy relationship with Israel. I mean, that's sort of a simple summary of it, but that's basically what they argued. So what happened? Well, when these started happening, they were highly publicized. In some cases, there were videos of protesters or people getting detained and taken. I got a call from a local reporter who I've known for a long time, excellent reporter. And this person called me because they know I'm a First Amendment lawyer and they wanted me to give my opinion on whether this conduct was a violation of the First Amendment. And this reporter was genuinely surprised when I didn't say right away, yes, absolutely, because they thought it would be clear cut. And the response I gave, and this was probably last spring before this was decided, I said, look, you obviously cannot engage in that conduct on the basis of somebody's speech. And the statute that the government cited to support it, the Nationality Act of Immigration Nationality Act of 1952, actually has a provision in there that says you can't do that. But you can do it if they're a non-citizen and there's a reasonable belief that it's going to significantly harm foreign policy. What I said to the reporter was this: look, this is complicated. What I think will happen is in each of these cases, there's going to have to be a fact-intensive review of what happened, and a judge or jury is going to have to decide, look, did the government in this case, based on all the facts, the witnesses, and the exhibits and the evidence, did they do this because of what the person is saying and what the person is doing and to try to chill others from doing it? Or did they do it because they reasonably believed there would be serious foreign policy consequences? So here's what happened here. The judge, William Young, is an 85-year-old appointee of President Reagan, called this case perhaps the most important ever to fall within the jurisdiction of this district court. held a full hearing and a 9-day bench trial on the issue, heard from 15 witnesses, reviewed 250 exhibits, which included public statements made by the President of the United States, Secretary of State, other leaders. He wrote a 160-page opinion that was the subject of widespread media coverage. I've never seen an opinion like this before, for this reason. The decision doesn't begin at the top of the page with what they call the caption of the lawsuit, which has the names of the parties, like People versus Larry Flint, right? Didn't have that at the top. Begins with a note he received on an anonymous note the judge received, followed by his response to the writer, which then introduces his decision. The note, I believe it looks like it's dated 19 June 2025. Trump has pardons and tanks. What do you have? This is what the judge wrote back. This is at the top of the decision. Dear Mr. or Ms. Anonymous, alone, I have nothing but my sense of duty. Together, we, capital W, the people, capital P, of the United States, you and me, have our magnificent Constitution. Here's how that works in a specific case. It's actually quite unique. The judge is trying to use this question, which otherwise has no basis in the decision or the case, as a way to communicate with the public who's going to read it. Never seen that before. So after that introduction, decision continues with a detailed description, testimony, statements, exhibits. After weighing everything, the judge ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. And he wrote, this court finds as fact and concludes as a matter of law that Secretaries Noem and Rubio and their several agents and subordinates acted in concert to misuse the sweeping powers of their respective offices to target non-citizen pro-Palestinians for deportation, primarily on account of their First Amendment protected political speech. They did so in order to strike fear into similarly situated non-citizen pro-Palestinian individuals, proactively and effectively curbing lawful pro-Palestinian speech and intentionally denying such individuals, including the plaintiffs here, the freedom of speech that is their right. Moreover, the effect of these targeted deportation proceedings continues unconstitutionally to chill freedom of speech to this day. Then the conclusion. He continues, the judge, his note to the anonymous writer. I hope you found this helpful. Thanks for writing. It shows you care. You should. Sincerely and respectfully, Bill Young. P.S. The next time you're in Boston, the postmark on the card is from the Philadelphia area. Stop in at the courthouse and watch your fellow citizens sitting as jurors reach out for justice. It is here and in courthouses just like this one, both state and federal, spread throughout our land, that our Constitution is most vibrantly alive. For it is well said that where a jury sits, there burns the lamp of liberty. Never seen anything like that before. So, this presentation began with a question. It's the topic. Does America still believe in free speech? I've been very careful to try not to give you my opinion on anything today, but I will do it now for this. And again, it's not the opinion of my law firm, the disclaimer. The answer is yes. And I think you could put the words "of course" after it. There are caveats and footnotes to it. But what we just read, whether you agree or disagree with the outcome or the people protesting or people who brought the suit, I think it shows that it still works. They work a little differently than our conception of what norms have been for a long time. I do agree that many Americans probably would like to silence speech they disagree with, or at least the loudest voices say that. That's what we hear a lot about now. And I do feel like a lot of the First Amendment battles today at least seem like they're escalating. Although if you look back throughout history, that may not be entirely true, but certainly in the more modern era. But we still have a fundamental constitutional right to free speech. We continue to utilize our court system to protect that right. Our courts continue to methodically decide these disputes, including a 160-page decision with a note or with a response to an anonymous note embedded in it. It's not quick, but they try to get it right. Not a perfect system, but it's a darn good one. Because if our constitutional rights are violated, if our rights to free speech are violated, we have, and I think more so than any country in the world, a system that allows us to try to vindicate those rights. So do we still believe in it? Yes, we do. Does it look or maybe feel different than it did 25 years ago? Yeah, it might. But I think you could say the same thing about 125 years ago. If you read about some of the rhetoric and the tensions in the 1860s, right? Or in the 1790s, the things that were written and done about politicians and people and their beliefs, some of what we see and perceive to feel today that dominates the airwaves isn't entirely new or novel. So I do think the answer is yes. I think we still believe, I certainly still believe, and I still believe we have the greatest forum in the world to vindicate those rights. So this is the time where you can ask me whatever you'd like, and we can discuss any of these topics. Yes, sir.
You mentioned earlier on about the Seventh-day Adventists and the reciting of the pledge. I wonder what you think about in, I believe it's Texas, and the requirements that in every classroom, the Ten Commandments should be posted, and how that might tie into some of this discussion.
I think there has been, I don't think I'm taking much of a position more than what I'm saying is there have been numerous court rulings that have stood for the proposition that violates the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, establishing a religion. I would predict that conduct will, and I think in some states that have done it, would quickly be determined to be unconstitutional at the federal district court and at the appellate court. It may be that some of these groups who are pushing the conduct and defending it, maybe they're trying to get it to the Supreme Court. Maybe they feel like maybe they can take another swing at it. I don't know. I've litigated First Amendment issues where, in one instance, I'm not going to say which one, but our adversary, which is from a very high-profile, smart group that litigates a lot in this sphere, suggested that they didn't agree with the way we were applying Supreme Court precedent and that they reserved the right to bring the issue before them again, right in their brief, which surprised me because it's usually not the strongest argument for we should win. It's more like, well, maybe he's right, but we're going to see if somebody else will disagree. So to answer your question, I think it's fairly well established, but maybe somebody's trying for another swing.
Well, that's kind of my thought, is trying to get it up to the Supreme Court. And I do wonder with the court as it's currently constituted, who knows what the court would rule, but I'm concerned about that.
I think, a lot of people point to the overturning of Roe v. Wade as sort of the focal point of concern. In that case, even though it was overturned, there was the whole case was about stare decisis, right? The whole first part of it, right? Which means the adherence to prior precedent of the court. It's a high bar to undo that prior precedent. And the court, whether you agreed or whether you disagreed with the decision, went through that analysis in detail. And so for those of you who may be concerned about a precedent that you agree with getting overturned or vice versa, I will tell you that the court will go through that rigorous process if they're going to consider that, overturning a prior precedent of the court. So, I mean, who knows? I have no idea what 5 justices will agree to do one day, but I do know that it's not as simple as just waking up one morning and deciding I don't want this anymore. There is an established test for overturning prior precedent, and the bar is high. So I put up a couple of issues, and I know we're probably getting near the end of time, but I'm wondering what Justice Jackson might have thought about some of these issues, particularly the biased response teams. Any ideas? There's a little bit, here's why I say that. I think the majority of those courts, if you're looking through their prism, would say, hold on here, you're chilling people from speaking their mind to and offending one another. And I have no earthly idea what Justice Jackson would say or write, but maybe you can make an argument that he would say, well, I tend to agree, we need to protect speech, but, he was so thoughtful, which is why he's one of the greatest legal minds in not just 20th century, but American history. He was so thoughtful that he would always worry about what are the practical consequences of saying complete hands off this speech. And I can't tell you what he would have written. Nobody can. But I'll go on a limb and say he would have really thought it through. He would have worked through it. Maybe he would have said, no, you can't go this far. The Constitution's not a suicide pact. Or maybe he would have said, hurt feelings aren't inciting a riot or a mob. But I think some of his words that are widely believed to have been inspired by his understanding of what precipitated in Germany to get us to Nuremberg. He was, paranoid's the wrong word, he was expressly concerned with intimidation of moderate voices, intimidation of what the introduction talked about, which is debate, discussion. And the quotes he gave then are 80 years ago, 75 years ago, are as true today as they were then. He witnessed what happened in a society that went from a democracy to something different, and he was very concerned that there were certain fragilities within the very protections we provided. It's true in the 1940s, it's true throughout the 20th century, and it's just as true today in the 21st century. And that's always my takeaway, is the level of thought and care he gave to that question that had to have been shaped by his experience. All right. Well, thank you. Appreciate it.
Aaron, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. I want to thank all of you for being here with us for the first in our 25 years of Asking Questions program series. There are flyers outside so you can keep abreast of the other programs in this series, as well as information on the Nuremberg Symposium. And for those of you who are Living Voices fans, that starts next week as well. So please do feel free to join us. As I said at the beginning, all of our programs are free and open to the public. So we do hope to see your faces often. Thank you very much and have a wonderful evening.